Welcome to the weekend, and welcome to episode 188 of the Inside the FLX podcast. This hour, we're going behind the scenes, previewing an event coming up in Monroe County, which stands as a great opportunity for the Finger Lakes as a whole. Women Rising, Resilience, Resistance, and Radical Connection will take place at the Woodcliff Hotel and Spa in Fairport on Friday, November 1st. And as the name implies, it's a day-long opportunity to foster dialogue, build skills, and build strategy that will help grow women leadership locally. In studio with me today to discuss it, Kristin Fragnoli. She's a certified professional coach with 30 years of experience in higher education as a professor and administrator. She supports others through her business, Quest Potential Leadership Coaching. Before we get to that conversation, though, I'd like to thank today's show sponsor, DeSanto Propane. Don't go with a company that pretends to be locally owned with a name that sounds familiar. Go with the team that is locally owned and operated and has been serving upstate New York since 1937. Over the last 80 years, DeSanto has developed a reputation for reliability and dependability that sets them apart from the competition. Quick turnaround times, on-time deliveries, and a fourth-generation family-owned business. To learn more, call 800-752-4574. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
First things first, let's talk about Quest Potential Leadership Coaching. That is
Great.
what you are personally involved with. So before we talk about the event, obviously, that we highlighted off the top, let's dive into that and get a little picture of what that's like.
Sure, that's great. So Quest Potential Leadership Coaching is my own business. So I'm currently working as a consultant and executive coach, doing leadership development, training, one-on-one coaching. And that grew out of, I started about 2 years ago, and that grew out of the career that I had in higher education. So I was in higher ed for almost 30 years as a professor of communication and then in some senior leadership roles, and then made the shift to working independently as a coach and leadership development consultant.
I can't help but ask, and I know we didn't really plan on talking about this part of it, but how does that transition happen? And walk me through that part of it, which got you into this.
It's such a great question. In some ways, I actually feel like I've returned to my roots, because when I was teaching, I was a professor of communication, so most of my work was around interpersonal communication, conflict resolution and mediation, cross-cultural communication, those kinds of topics that were very kind of skill-oriented and behaviorally based. And then I moved into leadership at the college and did some both serving as a leader and also training others in leadership. So when I got to the point where I felt ready to kind of do something new and exciting, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to bring all of that experience forward and just start working with people on a more individual basis to really help them hone their leadership. It's definitely been a journey for me, because after 30 years in a particular career, to make that leap to working independently has been my own little adventure. I'm still kind of growing into it, but it's been really fun and exciting challenge. And yeah, I have both the privilege of figuring out what I have to do every day and the challenge of figuring out what I have to do every day.
So obviously, I bet you've been putting a lot of energy into the event coming up November 1st.
Yes.
Obviously a big deal, kind of a unique event, or so it seems like it's unique in that I can't really recall seeing too many similar to this come up recently in the last several months to year. Walk us through what this event is.
Sure.
And what folks who show up can actually expect.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So as I've been working in this new role doing executive coaching, one of the areas that I was really interested in was kind of investing more and expanding more of my community-oriented work. And so the first step really was that I launched this kind of group called FLX Women, Finger Lakes Women, to really just try to find ways to bring women in the region together and start talking about leadership, start talking about what are our passion projects, what are the things that we're trying to do in our communities, etc. And from that really just grew this idea that wouldn't it be amazing to just bring together a whole room full of Finger Lakes women, although there will be more than women there, the conference is open to all, but to get people in a room together and really start talking about what leadership looks like for us and what do we need from each other to bring our leadership to the community, and how can we start thinking about leadership in maybe what I would think of as an expanded way. So that was really where the idea, the kind of seed of bringing a conference together came. And we are really trying to take a unique approach. So we're really looking at leadership in a very holistic way. So in my own business, I use the phrase all the time that you're the leader of your life. So regardless of whether you hold any formal leadership positions, you're the leader of your own life. And what do you want that to look like, and how do you want to use your time and energy? And so this conference will combine some discussions and talks that are what you think of as more traditional leadership topics, but then also looking at things that are about how do we tap into our own power, how do we figure out what we really are passionate about, and then try to do something with that, how do we want to live our lives. And so it's really about leading yourself as a person, and when you learn to do that, then you are much more suited to lead others. You become the kind of person that others want to follow and get engaged with. So it is kind of a side entry to the topic of leadership, a much less traditional corporate kind of way of thinking about leadership. It's very personal.
In your experience, how do those conversations typically start, or how do you start to have that conversation about personal leadership, sort of, and growing that into other forms of leadership in other areas of life?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think based on my experience as a teacher for all of those years and in the leadership roles that I have held, both formal and informal, for me, leadership always starts with self-awareness and with reflection and really kind of figuring yourself out first. I think that it can be really challenging to lead others or to do that well if you haven't sorted yourself yet. So really, and while that sounds so obvious, a lot of us go through our lives and our work without necessarily spending a lot of time reflecting purposefully on what are my values, what are my gifts, what's important to me, where are places where I want to grow, who am I, and why am I the way I am? And those are the places that when we tap that, I feel like then we can really just release whatever our own unique energy is. And that's when we all of a sudden find work that we don't mind doing for hours and hours on end. You know, we can get into a flow of what the kinds of projects that we bring ourselves to, and others can see that authentic energy, and I think that's when things start to happen.
So obviously with the focus of this particular conference being women in leadership, it's really broad, and it's one of those things that is baked in a lot of systemic issues.
Yes.
So I guess I want to start at the beginning, kind of work our way through some of those systemic issues and challenges that have kind of gotten us to where we are now.
Absolutely.
But to start it off, I do want to pose this to you. Where does it start in terms of getting folks to be able to wrap their minds around what the parts are, the moving parts are here, and how to just start the conversation, not just on a personal level, but sort of on a systemic level, so that progress can be made and a more conducive atmosphere can be experienced across the board, whether you're in an urban setting, a business setting, or in a rural community here in the Finger Lakes.
Right. So I think for me, that's a big question. But where I would say I would start is really kind of opening up the conversation with an acknowledgement that leadership takes many forms, and that we have not, in my opinion, tapped into all of the voices and all of the lived experience that we can in order to really bring diverse perspectives to solving the kinds of problems that we have. So, kind of in terms of social pressures and society, I think most people have an understanding that we've had a very kind of male-oriented, male-dominated power structure. And that in itself isn't necessarily bad. Those ways of leading can be very effective. But there are other ways to lead. There are other ways to see the world. There are other ways to move efforts forward. And I think the start of this conversation is, let's talk about what those ways might be, and let's get a more diverse group of perspectives around the table, so that we can all bring our gifts to solve whatever the problem is or to move something forward. So to me, that's the first reset, is just understanding that maybe we haven't even fully defined what good leadership is, because we need to talk about new and expansive ways of leading people.
And when you say that, and we start to dive into that and dissect that a little more, what are some of the ways of leadership or the types of leadership that maybe haven't been brought to the table as frequently as they should have been, to really make leadership better overall, not just in terms of gender roles one way or another, but to really diversify and to make it better, period?
Right. I think one of the ways is using a phrase kind of power with instead of power over. So the idea of looking at leadership in a very collaborative and cooperative way, where it's, you hear in the corporate parlance, you hear things like flat organizations or non-hierarchical. And I believe that. I agree that there's opportunity for more people to bring. And I think also just recognizing that the whatever the dominant way of thinking is, has value, but can be really informed by people who are seeing it differently. Whether that be because it's a gender difference, whether it be a cultural difference, whether it just be your lived experience that has been different. And so opening to all of those perspectives to make sure that we're really looking at an issue or a problem to be solved or a project to be created from multiple perspectives. We can have a more fully formed idea when we do that.
And when you look at sort of the opportunities, obviously, we're in the digital age.
Absolutely.
It's certainly not hard to get a message out there. It's certainly not hard to get different and new ideas out there. But getting them to stick is obviously a little bit of a challenge. And it kind of sounds like you're talking a little bit about the whole issue around groupthink in general. What role does that, if any, play in the problem that we see with sort of the split line in gender roles and in business and in leadership and that sort of thing?
What role does like a group think?
The group think in general, what role does that have in terms of preventing some folks who maybe just would really like to see more diverse voices at the table and see more discussion on different things, not even get to a point where they can say, I like that, bring that in, just because of the groupthink atmosphere that in a lot of cases does exist in business and corporate and even in sort of educational and a lot of other environments.
I think the word that comes to mind when I hear that question is that it really takes a lot of courage. It takes courage both from the individual who is trying to raise a perspective or an idea or a thought that is different than kind of the group thinking at that time. It also takes a lot of courage from those maybe who are already in power to step away from a standard practice of working. So we are comfortable with what we know. And when we reach out to try to do something differently, that can be we're unsure. That can be scary. So really, I think good leadership does take courage. And it takes an opening, a vulnerability to say, let me hear something that might at first blush feel really off the wall or really out of the ordinary, but let me kind of open myself to hearing that or to inviting those perspectives so that we can really think through something deeply.
And under those circumstances, how can, if there's someone who's listening or watching or thinking to themselves, I'm in this leadership role and I would like to do better and I would like to try and sort of help where I can. How do they sort of, if they're in one of those traditional environments, one of those environments that doesn't incorporate a lot of diverse voices, how do you sort of get the ball rolling or at least start to try and create a space where different folks can have different views and bring different things to the table?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think there's a couple sound relatively simple but are challenging to practice. One is actually training yourself to be a true deep listener to others, to really open up to hear what other people are trying to say to you and listen to that. The other really is very simply look around the decision-making tables, look around your work team, look around the people that you spend time with, and ask yourself if you really are already exposed to diverse perspectives and diverse experiences. Because if you're not, then you are going to continue to get more of the same perspective. So you can cultivate, and it's actually one of the things I talk with people about in terms of coaching, is we talk about building kind of a super network. And that is, you have your natural network of people that are created through your work, through your family, through your community, but sometimes the nature of that work, family, or community means that you're still not in a very diverse group of people. And so it's your responsibility as a leader to figure out how to open yourself to experiences and relationships that broaden your perspective. And sometimes that means you have to go out and actively pursue new ways of seeing and thinking. And we're enriched by it when we do it, but it doesn't always necessarily happen naturally, particularly in smaller communities like we live in the Finger Lakes. You don't have as many naturally occurring opportunities to have experiences that are different than what you have been accustomed to. So I think it's a challenge for every leader to really say, how do I stretch myself? How do I learn about parts of the world and people and ideas and perspectives that I haven't heard before? And how can I be informed by that?
And I'm glad you mentioned that and you went there with that part of the response, because I think that's one of the common threads on this program is that we regularly have conversations about how do you bring that into small rural communities that are shrinking, that have younger populations sort of drifting away and going elsewhere. How do some of these smaller communities capture that beyond an event like the one coming up November 1st, but just to sort of replicate and start to see happen over and over again where these different and new voices and new ideas are being brought to all tables, not just a select few here and there where it seems palatable for some people.
Right. Well, I think we can do that by making a conscious choice to put effort into that. And if it's on an individual basis, you can literally decide to, read books by authors from different backgrounds, take in art and experiences that are created by people from other cultures, just seek that out. We can get all of those things in our small town. Small towns still have Amazon or other places to look for those kinds of resources. As a community, I think that's really one of the places where our leaders could maybe at the table at this conference have a conversation, or after the conference have the conversation of, okay, we really do want to be committed to kind of a broader perspective about leadership and who's informing our decisions. So what specific actions can we take to get more of those perspectives around the table. And I imagine that there's all sorts of creative ways to do that. The first might be simply really reaching out and inviting people to connect with you. Mm-hmm. So one of the themes of the conference, so there's 3 themes of the conference: resilience, resistance, and the third is radical connection. And I think this part that we've started talking about is really about that idea of radical connection. And the concept behind that is really that we do have the opportunity to connect across difference, to open ourselves up, to be vulnerable enough to really talk about what's important to us, hear what's important to other people, and just, and I call it radical because you have to make a conscious effort to do it. It doesn't necessarily happen naturally. So seeking that radical connection is the first step where you start to really look at other people, and we see each other's humanity, we hear each other's stories. One of the things I was always so impressed with over my career in education would be meeting students and talking to them and hearing about their stories. And I taught in some urban settings that were very diverse, and then in some rural settings that were not as diverse. But regardless of those 2 contexts, when I really sat and listened to the backstories of my students and my colleagues, people are amazing. I mean, there's so many things that we can learn from each other. And even if we do have similar backgrounds on the surface, our lived experiences are so rich that we can connect to each other in a more powerful way. And I think once you do that, then you can really kind of bond with people and trust to make change together. So it's kind of a very humanistic kind of way of thinking about connecting with each other and trying to carry each other along together.
And I want to, since we started talking about the name of the event, obviously, those 3 words seem to be, or the 2 words in one phrase,
right,
appear to be intentional. Walk us through what
yes.
those are. Obviously, you talked a little bit about the last one, but the resilience and the resistance. Walk us through what those 2 and why they're there in the context of the conference.
Yeah, that's really important, because I feel like that's what will summarize kind of the spirit and the philosophy of the conference. So the whole title overall is Women Rising, Resilience, Resistance, and Radical Connection. And so the Women Rising is really, as I said before, the idea of using this day as a place to lift up women together, and men and other people, however they identify, to come together and talk about leadership in a new way. And then those 3 components, resilience is about how do we learn to build ourselves and each other up so that we can continue the hard work of leading, whatever that looks like. It's a tough world out there. We get run down. And when you are in a leadership position, those can be tough. You know, you have to fight through a lot of challenges as a leader. So having resilience as individuals and as leaders will mean that, one, we're caring for ourselves better, and we are therefore better able to care for other people and lead other people. And we can work to consciously develop more resilience. There are practices that we can use, individual and communal practices. So we'll talk about some of those at the conference. So just for example, there are 2 breakout sessions that jump to mind immediately that are about resilience. One is about using mindfulness practices. And those, generally people think about those as individual practices, but there are ways that those can be used in work teams and in families. And then there's another that's about how connecting with nature is actually a way to build resilience and therefore bring more to your leadership. So those are just a couple examples of thinking about leadership in new ways. Right? Probably most past leadership conferences that you will look up don't really talk about communing with nature as a form of leadership development, but it absolutely is, and we'll talk about what that looks like. The second, that concept of resistance, really has kind of a double-sided meaning. So the first is resistance in what many people think of as a more traditional kind of political way of thinking about resistance, and that is working to change systems that are unjust or that are not working. And women, are highly engaged in political activism, whatever that looks like. It doesn't have a particular brand of politics on it, but the idea that we're working to change systems. But then the interesting flip of that word of resistance is that a lot of times in our own leadership and in our own lives, we can sometimes resist change. So while we talk about resistance externally working to change unjust systems, we also then flip and think about, how am I resisting my own growth? How am I resisting my own change? And how do I overcome that resistance? How do I allow myself to kind of not hold myself back? And then the radical connection you heard a little bit about, and that's really just about opening ourselves up to connect with people across difference and across experience so that we can be stronger together.
And you alluded to it a little bit there. Obviously, some of the changes and some of the things issues that we're talking about today are political. They are systemic to a point of needing political will to change.
Right.
And I have to ask, because one of my colleagues here at Finger Lakes One, Jackie Augustine, would make sure that I ask you, how do we get more women, not just in different forms of leadership, but actually in elected leadership roles more frequently, especially in rural communities and communities that have been male-driven, and communities that frankly are, like many in the Finger Lakes here, majority white and don't have that diversity attached to them that creates a space for conversation around the idea.
Yes. Well, I certainly wouldn't say that I'm an expert in this particular process, but I do know that it's really important for us to create opportunities and specific systems to support women who have an interest in going into, elected office. I know that there are organizations that specifically really work on that. The idea of raising women's voices in civic activities is really important. We have to support women who run. So I won't go too far down the path, but the moment we think someone is not electable because she's a woman, we're hurting the cause of women in politics. So we have to stop. We have to really start thinking about our language and change our language in those kinds of ways. But really, women who enter politics, I think, need support early on, because the system is not necessarily a system that currently supports that. So we really have to find ways to give additional support to women in leadership. And interestingly enough, the conference actually will be talking about that. One of our main speakers, one of our main stage speakers, is a woman by the name of Melina Carnicelli. You probably know her in this region. Former mayor of Auburn, organizer of the Women's March here in Seneca Falls. And I've met her by getting involved in that group a little bit. But she has been involved with a group called Women Elect, which I can't really give you all of the details, but I would encourage people to find out more about that, because that's really helping women get into office. And she's also founded something called First Amendment First Vote, which is a civic engagement organization to support high school age girls. So it's really very similar to the idea that we hear about people have to see themselves in roles, that idea of representation. And really start to break down those barriers that being in politics, being a community leader in that way, is absolutely something that women can and should do.
And sort of looking beyond the scope of this event by itself is also part of this broader proposition to better educate and better inform and to better shape diverse leaders across the board at a young age, so that by the time they are entering adulthood and entering a community-wide impact zone, that they are better poised to play a role in this conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we have to model that. We have to model that, and we have to work very purposely towards that, because it is a process of making change and demonstrating that leadership can happen in all sorts of ways with all sorts of voices. So yeah, I think that we have to work very purposefully, because it may not happen organically.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. When you look at November 1st and you think about the best case scenario in terms of impact,
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of just reaching the widest audience you possibly can that day,
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the repercussions or reverberations from that day would you like to see in the months and weeks and potentially years following that, where more conversations and more events like this can happen here in the Finger Lakes?
Yeah, I love that question. So a few kind of immediate responses is, I hope that the people who participate on that day leave feeling really kind of catalyzed to go out and do that thing that they had been thinking about and maybe holding themselves back from. To really kind of take on that challenge or step into that leadership position that maybe that they weren't ready to step into. So I hope on a very one-to-one personal level, it just activates people to become more active. I know that it will help us develop connections, people who are there that day. There'll be some opportunities for, obviously for networking and for sharing ideas, but hopefully we can bring people together to then start something together, follow-up conversations. Our hope is that it will be so successful that everybody will just absolutely clamor for a second annual and a third annual and a fourth annual. So that's our expectation, is that we will definitely do that. And then actually at the end of the day, one of the activities that we'll do is we'll actually kind of crowdsource from the people who participate what are the kinds of things that they feel they need in order to continue this work, so that this group, FLX Women, and kind of the work that I do in leadership development can really start to think about how do we create some of those opportunities that people need.
Kristin, thanks so much for coming in. You're going to be back in less than a month. That's a sneak peek for everybody who's listening right now. You're going to be back in less than a month, and we're going to dig a little deeper into the personal background and how you got to where you are today.
Fantastic.
But best of luck with this event coming up. It's Women Rising: Resilience, Resistance, and Radical Connection. It's happening at the Woodcliff Hotel and Spa in Fairport on Friday, November 1st. Where can people learn more about the event, or just get some more information, get tickets, whatever they have to do to actually be there in Fairport on November 1st?
Yes, they can go to flxwomen.com. And there's all of the event information there. There's a bit more information about kind of FLX Women as an organization itself. There's a blog, which people can also submit to, because it's a gathering place for voices of many women. And you can subscribe and get updates.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Josh.
Hey, thanks for listening to Inside the FLX. You can subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Archived episodes are also available on the FingerLakes1.com app for Android and iOS. If you enjoy the show, programming like this, or just enjoy reading FingerLakes1.com each and every day, consider becoming a Patreon supporter for as little as $1 a month. You can help ensure that we're able to continue producing programming like this and keep doing what we do each and every day. Visit www.patreon.com/FL1 to learn more.
FingerLakes1.com